So this is sort of a follow-on to the video I just made about music today being inferior to music of yesteryear. Let's just put it that way. Some of us are not all 30, 40, 50 years old and constantly living nostalgic lives of the 60s and 70s. Funnily enough, a lot of the younger people that I teach reach back into their parents' catalog for their listening. So a lot of people, the tendency to have given up on today and its music is far-reaching. And the video I just did was about taking the time to seek out good music. It's there. It's just not going to be served to you on a plate. The infrastructure that we had in the 60s, 70s with the top 10, the top 20, top labels distributing to the public, consciousness about bands being made aware through tours and concerts, that's all gone. Music has sort of been, I use the word ghettoized, I think splintered into myriad fiefdoms. It might be a better phrase. There are bands now that produce their own music, they create their own label, they do all the work, they do the artwork, they put it on Bandcamp. That's what I do. And they're not necessarily touring or going the traditional route. They're trying to create a following, a small, humble following of listeners, just people that will listen, perhaps a few downloaders of their works, and that's the best that they can hope for. One of the arguments used is that music is no longer complex. All of this sophisticated chord structures of Beatles songs and the 70s rock songs and the proggers that came up with all these crazy alternative tunings and different chord structures and working with modes instead of just major and minor keys. It is hard to find musicians that seek out a different language, but it's out there and you will find it. Again, I'm saying there are plenty of progressive. Some of them are derivative. They try to sound like the prog rock of the 70s, but I would say there's a lot of innovative new stuff going on. It's really easy to write a song in C and not modulate, but use the 1-4-5 structure and then relative minor. Just made that up. That's just using 1-4-5. With a relative minor 6 or a 2. It's all chords from the scale, right? It's really easy to do that. But I just the song on the new album that I just put out, I try to be different. I start out with an open chord like that and move to a that's the opening chord structure to the song. I'm not the only one doing that. I'm guilty every once in a while of writing a song that deals with simple chords in a simple either major or minor scale. Maybe music complexity is not important for the song. I'm reaching for something else, or I want to connect on some level. And there are other times where I'm bored by all that. I want to create something either that works with a different harmonic structure or does something unexpected, tonally, or even mess with tunings and that sort of stuff. And again, I'm not alone in doing this. There are a plethora of people out in the world that are experimenting all the time in all those things. The idea that the 60s and 70s bands experimented and today's bands don't is also a reduction or a sort of a hyperbole, if you wish. Yes, we had the Beatles. Yes, we had progressive bands. the acid rock scene. Rock was new. People were doing new stuff. We had all that in the 60s and 70s. There was lots of innovation. But also there was a ton of music in that era that did the safe thing, that did the pop thing, that was derivative, that just copied whatever was popular and tweaked it and marketed it and, rode somebody else's coattails to a hit. The 50s was rife with that, particularly, sort of suburban white bands, adopting a music language from African American culture, whether it be jazz or R&B, funk, and sort of remarketing it to a mass audience. I mean, if you think about the Stones and some of those other neo blues explosion bands, I mean, they were really just cribbing the language. Sometimes directly, they would take straight songs out of the old blues catalog and then just sort of give it a new sheen and sell it back to the US market. It's kind of one of the great ironies of 60s and 70s music. But my point is for every Beatles, there are hundreds of far less interesting, less innovative, less diverse bands out there. I mean, the 70s gave us, lots of inane, just sort of really nondescript, blues-orientated rock music. The 80s produced sort of that wave after wave of synth pop. The early innovators were interesting, but the second, third generations, it got more and more derivative, less interesting as we went along. So each generation is guilty of lots of inane music, even in the great decades that we laud for, what people my age say was the era of golden music. It was and it wasn't. I mean, there was a lot of terrible music. Go and look at the charts from 1965 or 68. You won't see all of the bands that are sold to us now as the pride of the 60s. The charts weren't always full of bands like The Doors and Zeppelin. There's a lot of pop music there that's been forgotten. And this is true of all eras. If you go back to the 18th century, we consider, the late Romantics and composers like Liszt or Chopin, Dvorak, as being representative of that period. Back in those days, they weren't even the most popular. The salon composers, of which we don't remember any of the names, were far more popular. Or if you go back to the 15th, 16th century and you go to a play in London, you're not going to see Shakespeare. You're going to see, what was a plethora of playwrights that were writing in the same period as Shakespeare that were far more popular and appealed to mass audiences a lot more than Shakespeare ever did in his time. So we sort of reinvent history, particularly when we talk about music. We refer to a golden age because we retrospectively recatalog that era. We talk about the 60s, we talk about the great music, the innovators of that period, but we leave out all the schlock. We leave out all of the terrible, dribbling, saccharine-based music that punctuated that era far more than the innovative bands did. Not everybody was a hippie in the 60s. Not everyone was progressive. America was a very conservative country back then. The hippie movement, the peace and love movement, in 1969 is known as the year of love or whatever. For most of the country, it wasn't. I mean, that was a very small minority, but now it's taken over our consciousness as that's what everybody was doing back then. While I was growing up in the 80s, I got into bands like The Cure and Before that, bands like Joy Division and Crass, and some of the punk, post-punk, um, doom rock kind of early stuff in the 80s. And now we think of the 80s as being synonymous with that. It wasn't. We were a minority. Um, as folks that dressed in black and went to those shows or played that music. It was a small scene. There was a lot more going on during that decade that's now been forgotten because it's non-memorable music. But the 80s was incredibly conservative. It was the age of Thatcher and Reagan. And although we can now look back at all these great underground developments in the 80s, it was a torturous decade in many senses for music. You had explosions of innovation. You had new stuff coming out and sort of seeping into the mainstream. But you also had, a lot of really poor standard, non-challenging music that was being constantly produced and marketed to the public in that decade. We have it now, and we tend to judge this era as being non-distinct or nondescript as far as music goes. It's just that you never hear. There's no system by which you can hear the better music unless you are an avid concert goer and you take a chance on bands you've never heard of, where you, like me, spend hours trolling through YouTube, Bandcamp, SoundCloud, even Spotify if you use that system, to find, bands you've never heard of and discover new albums and things like that. The old days of going to a record shop, I used to have this speed down. I used to be able to go through, a brick of 100 albums in 26 seconds. I used to spend days combing for records. Those of you my age will probably remember those days. You spend your paycheck at the record store. You come home with 10 albums from the dollar bins, and you spend a day lying on the floor listening to the music and reading the back of the sleeve. All these bands you'd never heard of, but you took a chance because it was $1 in the dollar bin. I discovered a lot of music that way. That sort of adventurous spirit has been marketed out of us. I know very few people, and frustratingly few people my age, that take any time at all to seek out new music. They tend to just listen to the same playlist or stay in the same genre over and over and over again. Like, music is a repetitive comfort device. Constantly being fed the familiar is all they require from music. They just want to feel good. So that, seeking out new challenges, being accosted, threatened by music, by new music, having your ears, having to get used to a new sound or a new approach, is not important to a lot of people. And you kind of have to realize that. And if you do, like me, need a steady diet of new music, you have to spend time and energy to go find it. I sometimes take a whole evening to troll for new music. I make lists. I still buy albums. I still download songs. I prefer to buy albums if I really like the band. But we are a minority now. For most people, music has become a free commodity, a comfort device, a background activity. It's no longer the primary activity. They're doing something else while they have music on, and they're not fully listening. Those of us that, when we turn music on, it consumes your whole consciousness and you can't possibly be doing anything else. We're a minority now. It's changed in so many ways. But to use all that and say, well, that's because there's no good music coming out today, it's already all being done, is preposterous. It's just not true. It's harder to find. It's harder to get to. It takes more patience to find it. Even in this digital age where you have everything at your fingertips, it still takes time and conscious effort. And you listen to a lot of crap while seeking out stuff. It's still out there, still a lot of good stuff being put out. And that's the point of these two videos that I'm doing on this topic. It's important to me. I'd be really interested to hear what you think. Not everybody is like me. Some people like that repetitive nature of sticking with a few favorites and really familiarizing yourself with their music and their ideas rather than constantly be looking for the new. We have different listening habits and different criteria for music. We need to keep that in mind as we make assessments about the whole music scene and where it's going. It is changing. A lot of it's for the worse, but at the same time for the better. The digitization of music has many drawbacks, but it also has opened up the world for more people to put music out there. And while that may mean more bad music, a sort of dilution of talent, if you will, it also means that people that would never have had the chance to get their music heard are now able to do that. So there's a lot of great stuff out there, trust me. And I hope that I've got that point across in the last two videos. We'll get back to guitars soon. All right.